Today's sermon is titled Your Brain on God, to be delivered by Dr. Lloyd Moffett. The sermon covers the following principles. Principle 4, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Principle 7, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Dr. Lloyd Moffett is a professor of comparative religion at Cal Poly, occasional columnist for the Slow Tribune, and a part-time sustainable builder. His latest two books are on the spirituality of wine, titled The Spirit of Wine, Finding Religion in the Fruit of the Vine, and The Spirit of Winemakers, Finding Religion from the Vineyard to the Bottle. When not writing and speaking on religion, he grows grapes, makes wine and beer, parents his two sons, and convenes gatherings at his community farm, the Lavra. And I give you Dr. Lloyd Moffett. Yay. There's you.
Thanks, Randy. I particularly chose that little Hamlet interchange just to bring Randy's theatrics to Zoom. Yes, well done, well done. I think I've spoken more than a dozen times at Cambria, but this is my most nervous moment of speaking because I'm going to be talking about the neuroscience behind spiritual experience and the latest research on it. At times today, it may sound like I have a good grasp of neuroscience, but I can tell you with authority that is only in your imagination that is the case. I'm not a scientist by training. I took precisely 0 science classes in college, but I, for the last 3 years, have immersed myself in the scientific literature and spent a lot of time with neuroscientists and neuropsychologists trying to understand what's going on in the brain. And thanks to their patience, I think I have some grasp of what is going on, but see this more as a translation effort from the scientific community to us, as opposed to an original researcher on the science. But let me explain why I started doing this. I have one nephew. It's my sister's child, Ian. And about 7 years ago, at the age of 10, Ian began to experience the first symptoms of psychosis. Now, Ian's parents are not particularly religious, and he lives in pretty secular Seattle. But the psychosis sometimes would manifest itself in hallucinatory visions and voices that were religious in character. You can sometimes see Jesus and angels, but also sometimes demons and devils. And as it turns out, his only uncle is a religious studies professor who studies mystical visions. And so I was, especially early on, called upon often to relay to Ian and his parents from a position of a PhD that the things in his head weren't real. And I could convince Ian that he wasn't actually seeing demons or Jesus, but his mind was playing tricks on him. After about 7 years of being in and out of psychiatry wards at Children's Hospital and visits with some of the most famous doctors in the world, we still don't actually have a great diagnosis for Ian's condition. Perhaps chronic Lyme disease leading to some neurological issues. And I will continue to sort of dutifully walk Ian out of his visions, but I wonder what my role is as a professor, because I also teach Hildegard of Bingen. Now, Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century began to experience visions and voices as a teenager, led to bouts of terrible sickness, and she would hear angels singing to her, which she transposed into musical scores that's still used in the Catholic Church, because in her case, she wasn't put in a psychiatric ward, she was put in a nunnery and lifted up even during her age as a potentially saintly woman. She was actually the first woman canonized in the Catholic Church, and she was eventually named a doctor of the church in 2012. And I began to ask myself, as I started looking at these two figures in my life. What's the difference between them? Like, why can I say with authority that Ian is seeing things, that his mind's making things up, and yet with Hildegard of Bingen, I take it as a given? And what I realize is that when I first started studying, from the time when I first started studying religion a couple of decades ago, there's arisen a new field that might be helpful in understanding what's going on in the brain during profound religious experiences. There's new technologies that have evolved that allows scientists to map the brain in the midst of a variety of different experiences. And these are MRIs, PET, SPECs, CT scans, a bunch of other acronyms. I don't even know really what they stand for, let alone the chemistry and the physics behind them. But it struck me that there's a lot of potential here to understand what's going on in the brain. If we could just look at a neurological level of what transpires in the midst of a profound spiritual experience, then we could have an objective way to say, in this case, it is your brain playing tricks on you. Now, we can't exhume Hildegard of Bingen, but perhaps we could look at the brains of contemporary spiritual masters in the midst of such experiences. Would their brain look the same, or would it look different from those who are experiencing psychosis? It seemed to me like a scientific and objective criteria. If we could just peek inside the brain of somebody on God, then perhaps we could determine what is happening there. That was my hope. Early on, though, I realized that we had a problem. That first and most importantly, convincing even a saintly person in the midst of a profound spiritual experience to jump on a gurney and be inserted into a machine to scan their brain didn't prove easy. It seemed like nothing dulls the spiritual buzz like being strapped down and put into something that makes beeps. So finding a control group of spiritual masters proved to be a problem. Now, there were like monks and nuns who would be studying in the midst of meditation or prayer, and there's some really interesting work done there. But that's something different to me than having a vision or a voice or a mystical experience. That's something that happens on a day-to-day basis. So we just don't have the example of somebody having an ecstatic experience with God, a mystical experience with God, profound experience of God, and being put into any of the brain scanning technologies. Likewise, finding someone in the midst of spiritual psychosis to get them at that same exact moment to stand still and go into a neuroimaging machine also has proved difficult. As it turns out, if you think you're seeing God or a demon, you're not inclined to jump on a gurney and be wheeled in. So while the technology for a dynamic study of brain activity is there, we don't have the alignment of the perfect control group and then on the other side. One solution, by the way, is to study people in the midst of psychedelics, because they have actually been willing to get into brain scanning technology. So we have lots of examples of people under LSD or magic mushrooms, psilocybin. And there's a lot of super interesting research being done on that. And I'm happy to come back at a point and talk about the implications of that for spiritual understanding of spirituality, but it also raises a bunch of potential issues ethically and nature. So we won't get into that today. So what have we learned? Well, one thing that religious studies scholars teamed with neuroscientists have found out is that we look at the cognitive architecture of those who are prone to have spiritual experiences, we can get an understanding of what parts of our brain are involved in having a profound spiritual experiences. If someone is prone to have a number of different spiritual experiences, how are their brains different than those who tend not to have them? And there's some really interesting insights here. First, what we found is that those who are prone to have spiritual experiences are primed to have them. That is, you don't just have spiritual experiences, don't just come out of the blue upon people who were not expecting one. Rather, spiritual practitioners prepare themselves for profound spiritual experiences. You might even say they train for such experiences. So while we might not be able to make the spiritual experience happen, you can't schedule one for next Thursday at 3 p.m. on Big Sur, I'm going to see God. But that's not how it's work. We can't order them out of like a spiritual cocktail bar or something like that. But it is true that we're also not passive participants, twiddling our thumb until God strikes us with a grand moment of transcendence out of the blue. Rather, those who are prone to spiritual experiences attune their brain so as to be prepared for that spiritual experiences. And let me use an analogy here. One of the most rare songbirds is this one, a regent honeyeater. A bird so rare that only a handful of people have ever seen one in the wild. While their song can sound like other species, ornithologists with a keen ear can point out that this bird is different from other birds. And catching that song could be an experience of a lifetime, a sort of equivalent of a profound spiritual experience. But note that if you have not spent years listening to the song of birds, discerning the regent honeyeater's song from another song is hopeless. If you put me out and I happen to fall upon this incredible experience, I wouldn't be aware of it. It would just sound like some other bird. So if you haven't done the preparation, you're not primed to be able to distinguish these things from happening. Well, researchers are finding something similar happen with pinnacle spiritual experiences. Those who are inclined to frame the world in spiritual ways tend to have spiritual experiences. Now, it doesn't have to be, you said 1,000 Hail Marys or fasted regularly, then, you can wait for it to happen. But there is this sort of priming, and it also shapes the kinds of spiritual experiences we have. It's why Christians never have a deep spiritual experience and suddenly Buddha pops up, right? Or Buddhists don't end up finding, Allah in the midst of things. But the extraordinary part of this priming is that it doesn't just prepare us to interpret events in a spiritual way, but actually fundamentally shapes our view of reality itself. In neurological terms, it seems like we have a role in creating our reality. Scientists are discovering our perception of reality is largely constructed by our mind, not given to us. Now, this is somewhat extraordinary, so let me try to explain what people are saying. Before I started this research, I used to think that our brain was largely reactive. We kind of go into life. We enter a new room, and there's a bunch of data, and we then make sense of that. And so when we experience something new, a song, a sunset, an idea of a book or something, then our brain processes it. It makes sense of whatever stimulus comes to us. And so I suppose that the raw data came into the brain, and then we processed that raw data, and some people were better at processing than others, but our sense of reality was shaped by the data coming to us. Neuropsychologists, however, have shown that the process behind the consciousness of reality is actually more complex than my simplistic understanding. Brain scanning technology has shown that our immediate sense of the present is influenced as much by our neurological expectations as by stimulation from outside of us. You see, our brains have evolved to be very efficient little machines. Instead of being bombarded by a whole bunch of data at any moment, that is like what I happen to see, smell, taste, feel, our brain creates expectations about what we think will likely be there and ignores most of the potential data. So, for example, right now, my brain could literally process billions of information from outside of me, from the smell of Randy at this moment, the faces of each of you, at least the top half of your faces, the bubbling up of gas from my breakfast burrito, the idea that I should have combed my hair or something. Like, there's all sorts of things that could pop in my mind at this moment. But neuroscientists have discovered that our brain constructs the reality that I'm experiencing and ignores most of that data. And the filtering process allows our brain to have the bandwidth to engage some of the data well and not be overwhelmed by all that data out there. And this process happens seamlessly and immediately, so we're not aware of how much of our experience is actually stimulated by our neurological expectations rather than our engagement with the world as it is. And let me give you an example of this. So let's say that you've been with your spouse for many years, and now for the last year and a half, you've hardly left your house, and so you're perhaps seeing your spouse more often. So when you look at your spouse for the 50th time in a day, you think your vision is a result of your data, seeing your spouse, going through your eyes to your occipital lobe in the back, which for reasons I don't understand, split sides. But anyhow. But what we know that happens now is that instead of your brain wasting the time to process your visuals, instead, what goes to your occipital lobe is mostly your expectation for what your spouse looks like. It creates a vision of your spouse based on your experiences with this person and uses that expectation to preserve bandwidth in the brain. So strictly speaking, you don't see your spouse most of the time you're looking at them, but your brain is creating an image to preserve bandwidth, you might say. And our brain does this all the time. So when we see a ball thrown, our brain actually doesn't look at that ball. Rather, we've seen a lot of balls thrown through the air, and so it takes one spot and then just your brain maps onto the rest of your brain where that ball is supposed to be. When we look at words on a page, we don't actually read the whole word, but rather we look at the start and then its context, and we figure out what the letters are. You probably have done that internet thing where it's shocking how good you can read even with most of the word missing. And this means filtering reality through the lens of experience. This serves us really well because it allows us to be mentally quick, processing a huge amount of information in just milliseconds because we ignore most of the data that comes into it. So if a spouse gets a surprise haircut, we probably aren't going to notice that because we're actually not looking at our spouse. Our brain is mapping what that person looked at. And if you didn't know a haircut was coming, you have no reason to expect that to happen because we're living in this constructed reality. We're not noticing the haircut, not because we don't care, but because our brain is acting really efficiently. I'm not sure that explanation is going to get you out of the doghouse for not noticing a haircut, but nonetheless, it's worth a try. Now, understanding this is really important because our proclivity to have a profound spiritual experience requires us to bring to the parts of our brain that modulate reality a spiritual lens. Just as the experienced birdwatcher is able to filter out the sound of other bird calls and hone in on that unique call of the regent honeyeater, so those who have trained their brain to find God simply are more likely to bring to their modulated reality a godly lens. We can choose to see the world spiritually or choose not to see it spiritually. And this means that if you have friends or family members who never have had a profound spiritual experience, it may just be they've never cultivated a spiritual lens that would lead to such experiences. Their brains are not primed to process reality through a spiritual lens. They will literally have a secular outlook compared to others. So part of the equation for understanding the neuroscience behind spiritual experience is to appreciate the role of priming or training. That's the first lesson. The second lesson looks at the parts of the brain that fire when we have what we determine to be spiritual experiences. And neuroscientists have long realized that the processing reality involves a lot of different parts of the brain. Now, mapping parts of the brain has been happening ever since Phineas Gage's unfortunate accident on the railroad. But the Russian Alexander Luria did this a lot with brain-damaged soldiers in World War II, and we find things like the occipital lobe is for visual processing, the parietal lobe is for movement and orientation, et cetera, et cetera. But more advanced understandings have realized that mental processes occur in networks, so that it's not just one part of the brain firing, but a network that hits a lot of different parts of the brain. There's a lot going on there. And one of the most interesting series of works is the work associated with the association network, which is different parts of the brain that try to assimilate the modulated reality that we have. To understand this, let's go back to our bird watching example. As a bird watcher gains experience over time, they become more efficient at identifying different bird calls. So when you hear when a bird watcher listens to a song, it sort of goes through your brain and checks off, okay, not that, not that, not that, all without it consciously thinking of that. And by the way, expectations play a role here too. What birds would you expect to hear in this place and what would you not hear? But the association network usually becomes more efficient over time, rejecting associations that don't fit with our modulated reality. Now, the association network modulates every part of life. We're constantly running through our brain this filtered reality and exploring potential connections and attempts to make definitive determinations. This involves sending new information to a variety of parts of the brain that govern different aspects of thought and reflection in order to make a useful connection. So the more experiences we have, the more likely we are to work through that process efficiently. We cut off associations that we have found not useful. So you might be at a restaurant and say, oh, that waiter over there looks vaguely like my fourth grade teacher. Well, some corner of your brain may make that association, but since it's not a useful one for you, you probably will stop looking to find people that are like your fourth grade teacher. In fact, the association network in our brain creates grooves that are sear into your brain the common kinds of connections you make. This is one of the parts of neuroplasticity, if you know this term. It is the way we naturally program our brain to be like a computer, to look for particular associations first and ignore associations that have been not useful in the past. This means when someone accuses you of being old and closed-minded, you can tell them that what they're witnessing is actually a really efficient brain that doesn't waste time in unfruitful associations. Again, that probably won't be received particularly well, but nonetheless, it is true. As we age, we create ways of associating that become more and more fixed over time. And this helps us understand people who are prone to have spiritual experiences. When scientists look at the association network within the brains of spiritually prone people, they notice that certain parts of the brain tend to fire in different ways than those who don't have spiritual experiences. Let me give you just one example of this research. One study that has been done is looking at all the people who were brain damaged in the Vietnam War. Huge data set. They identified 116 veterans who had brain damage from the Vietnam War, who also claimed to have profound spiritual experiences bordering on mystical experiences. They put those 116 veterans in CT brain scanning technology, see what part of their brains, was there any correlation between this part of the brain being damaged and the propensity to have spiritual experiences. And what they found was that a particular area of the prefrontal cortex, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, tended to correlate with propensity to have spiritual experience. In other words, if you were unlucky enough to have your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex damaged in the midst of war, you were quite likely to spend the rest of your life having spiritual experiences. Interesting. Well, what role does the DLPFC play? Well, the DLPFC is linked to imposing inhibitions. It's the reality check of the associated cortex. So when you go to consider something, it's a gatekeeper that says, don't entertain that or entertain that. That's part of the role. And without going through all the other research, almost every example of brain damage correlated to spiritual experiences involve brain damage to a part of the brain that acts as one of these gatekeeper functions, one of these that modulates what we're open to entertain or not. And so in the brains of people who are damaged and have spiritual experiences, those part of the brains that say, stop, don't entertain that, are compromised. But here's what's interesting. We can also train those same parts of the brain to be more open, like literally open-minded to experiences. And so the hypothesis here is if we want to have spiritual experiences, we need to take those parts of our brain that tends to be closed-minded to it and literally open them up, neurologically open them up. If you want to have spiritual experiences, you have to take your gatekeeper function and broaden the width of those gates. And the implications here are actually potentially fascinating. Maybe as we go through life, we actually stumble on all sorts of things that are potentially spiritually impactful to us, but we have overactive gatekeepers in our association networks that preclude us from recognizing them. In other words, we might have something that is possibly spiritually meaningful. Maybe it's a beautiful sunset. Maybe it's a moment of love for a family member. Maybe it's the taste of an aged Burgundy. Maybe it's a perfect drive off a tee. Perhaps these ones have the potential to have spiritual impact, but our gatekeepers are squelching those potential spiritual impacts of them. I mean, maybe so many more people could go through life having spiritual experience or potential for spiritual experiences, but they literally don't recognize me. They literally don't recognize them. And so people are wondering why I don't have spiritual experiences in my life. You can say your mind is closed to them, neurologically closed to them. Perhaps we're all potential mystics and we can just pry open the doors of perception here. So to summarize just two of the important things that come from the study of those who have spiritual experiences. First, they prime their brain to bring a spiritual lens to the world, to their construction of reality. Second, they encourage their brains to make atypical associations, which allow them to connect their extraordinary experiences with divine or spiritual source in a new way. Perhaps we just need to be open to the profound spiritual experiences. And here we come to our readings. When the Buddha says our mind is the creation of our mind, it seems like he's anticipating an insight that neuroscientists have just more recently come to understand. Through priming in the associated network, we shape our reality in very real ways. We create the lens through which we see the world and the network through which we process the world. And this realization can be both frightening and at the same time hopeful, because as he says, if we approach the world with an impure mind, that is the world we live in, because that's our modulated reality. If we approach the world with a pure mind, that joy that comes from that is our reality. We have to create that spiritual lens. And you don't have to wait for God or an inspiring guru to make that happen. You can do that. And I think that's what Hamlet is reflecting too. Here, even the socialist utopia of Denmark can seem like a prison, right? If you framed it in that way. But the great thing about it is we have the power to change that frame, to refocus or realign it if we want to have spiritual experiences or not. It doesn't have to be a prison. Denmark becomes a prison because our mind makes it so. And so where does that leave me in trying to understand that basic question that started this all with my nephew? Well, Ian's a very sweet boy, and his brain probably looks very little different than the traditional mystics or spiritual heroes of the past. Through disease or genetic mutation, he has come to see the world through a spiritual lens and is open to associations that most of us are not. Perhaps Hildegard of Bingen or the psychedelic user's brain would look the same. We will, in all likelihood, never be able to put all three of them together, but my suspicion is that the neural activity might look similar. The difference lies in the result or impact of the propensity to have non-ordinary spiritual experiences. In Ian's case, it's ultimately destructive and life-negating gift. For him, and sadly for some around him, it's problematic. His demons tell him that his teacher wants to kill him, or Jesus hates the Disney films his sister watches. And that's a prison to live in. But in Hildegard's case, her visions inspired hundreds of thousands of people across the globe in many centuries to live deeper, more effective lives. Her unique brain expanded those around her to see the more beauty, more love, and more grace in the world. And so it's perhaps just the impact of the brain that's the difference. But I've also come to think that Ian's story teaches us something else that we all can learn from, because it led me to realize a truth that's behind so many different religious traditions, that there's more to the world than our little brains allow us to experience. How much of our spiritual disappointments in life are because we didn't choose to open our mind to the spiritual possibilities there. Just maybe if we train our minds and approach the world with spiritual wonder, we might experience something new, something profound, and something beautiful. Perhaps such a hope is not very scientific, but it came to me from dipping toes in the scientific world. And at least I hope it's something to think spiritually about. Thanks.